Hey, everybody. Welcome to an all new episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon. My co host, Nick Severi, is out in the wilderness of Wyoming, but joining me in his stay is always friend of the pod, GZERO Media correspondent, Alex Kliment. Alex, good to see you, buddy.
I'm glad to be here from the wilderness of Harlem, New York, Harlem, USA. Here I am.
I was going to say a similar wilderness, just a lot more buildings and a different opponent out there in the streets. On the program today, Alex and I, the Foreign 411, this episode is titled. So we're going to go around the world, Alex, 45 minutes. You and I, we're going to look at the latest in the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, the recent ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hezbollah. And then you've got the hostage negotiations that are still ongoing. Plus, we're going to get into the latest cabinet appointments by President-elect Trump and how they will potentially shape our foreign relations and policy in 2025 and beyond. We're going to get all of Alex's take, all of the great work he's been doing over at GZERO Media. You can go check all of it all out, gzeromedia.com. Before I say hello to Alex and we talk about whether Juan Soto will be a Met or a Yankee, amongst other things, some
I think those are
housekeeping.
the only two choices. Okay, all right. Okay.
Well, it's not the Blue Jays. It's definitely not the Blue Jays. Some housekeeping notes, real quick. A new show is coming to Leon Media Network starting in December. Journalistically Speaking with Emmy and Peabody Award winner Rick Sanchez back on Leon Media Network each day. That's right, you heard me. Each day, Monday through Thursday, Rick is going to examine a key story making headlines and get the perspectives of someone who has been working in journalism for over 30 years. Journalistically Speaking with Rick Sanchez. Check it out over on leonmedianetwork.com, or that's when the show launches. You can subscribe there. Follow Rick on Twitter, on X at Rick Sanchez TV. I'm excited to have that show. And the former CNN, Fox News, MSNBC great giving his perspectives on the world of news and reporting. Obviously, he's got so many different relationships. The man's interviewed 4 different presidents. I've interviewed 0 presidents, Alex, a bunch of members of Congress, but one day I'm working my way up there. So first, I say hello to you, buddy. How have you been? How is, we haven't spoken, you and I text, but we haven't spoken since the election.
Yeah.
How is everything in New York? Because I'm down here in Florida. What's been the mood and sentiment up there in New York, and obviously in GZERO Media circles too? Because a new president-elect Trump. I think when we had you on the show last time, we talked a little bit about the differences between what a Biden or at least a Harris administration would look like foreign policy wise versus a Trump administration. But what's the mood and sentiments up there your way?
Yeah, look, I mean, New York was not Trump country previously, but shifted more than I think a lot of people expected in that direction, right? So I mean, like, people who really didn't see Trump winning at all are obviously sort of distraught. Although I think much less. It seems to me much less energized than last time around. Like in 2016, when Trump won, there was this real sense among liberals, Democrats, that they were like ready to resist and ready to go out and fight and ready to go out and protest and do all this stuff. I don't get the sense from those people this time around. It was the same vibe. It was more just sort of like shock and kind of had the wind knocked out of them that, the realization that Trump is not a fluke, that he is a reality. He is not a bug of the system. He is a feature of it for the foreseeable future. So I think that was certainly different than in 2016 when it seemed more like this sort of out of left field thing that, couldn't possibly be the real America. Well, actually, it is the real America. And not only that, he was quite popular in New York this time around too. So I think the mood is definitely very different. And I think there's also the sense that that Trump comes into office knowing the ropes a lot better this time, and may make a much stronger push on the things that he's promised to push for, whether people like them or not. He's going to go for it, and he's got the team to do it. So we'll see.
Yeah. You said something there I want to follow up on that it's going to funnel perfectly into our first segment before we even touch on Juan Soto and whether or not he's wearing pinstripes or blue and orange. But you just mentioned it there about it's his second time around.
Yeah.
And so now he knows a little bit more. So this is perfectly going to funnel into Russia, Ukraine, because you and I have joked about this. The man said he would get this resolved in 24 hours. It's been 4 weeks, right? But all jokes aside, the latest that's happening in the war, you wrote this great article that we posted over on our social media account. I would love for you first just get into what is the latest in the war. But the opinion piece that you wrote about the Ukraine war has really reached its most dangerous moment yet. And I remember seeing this going, whoa, most dangerous moments yet. I mean, it's not even Thanksgiving yet when you wrote this piece. And you
Right.
made an analogy, you made a sports analogy. We've been joking about sports, about soccer and how in the final minutes of something probably concluding, everyone goes their hardest and tries to score the most goals. So take us a little bit inside the latest in the war. And then obviously the president elect coming in here now, second time around. Do you really think now that this is solidified that he is going to be the president? Do you think this war ends, in 2025?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned he pledged to end the war in 24 hours. He didn't say when those 24 hours would start. Right? So
Right.
so we'll see. But no, that was a big pledge of his on the campaign trail to end the war. He's been skeptical of aid to Ukraine. Certainly JD Vance, his running mate, has made his own case against continuing to support Ukraine. Look, I mean, the analogy that you mentioned in the piece I wrote, yeah, it's that in the last 5 minutes of a soccer game, no holds barred. Everyone goes for maximal gains before the whistle blows. And of course, in this case, with the analogy, the whistle blowing is Donald Trump coming into office on January 20th of next year with a very different view of the Ukraine war from what the Biden administration's view has been, which is to support Ukraine for as long as it takes to reach a somewhat unclear goal, but you want the Ukrainians to be well enough armed to argue for what they want when they finally do sit down and talk. Trump's view is that the time to talk is sooner rather than later, and that he wants to, use the U.S. leverage to get both the Ukrainians and the Russians to the table. What you're seeing on the ground is both sides doing this last 5 minutes of a soccer game thing, where they're just going completely for broke. On the Ukrainian side, the US and UK gave the Ukrainians permission to use long range missiles for the first time. US made and UK made long range missiles in order to hit Russian positions and military assets that are supporting the invasion of Ukraine. They've been firing those. That was considered a big red line by the Russians. The Russians, in response, tested in the field a new hypersonic missile called an Oreshnik missile, which can carry nuclear warheads, can be an intercontinental ballistic missile. The way they used it in Ukraine was as a conventional weapon, but the signal was clear. It was, look, we're not going to split the atom on you guys this time, but if you keep pushing our red lines, we may just do that. And Russia has been warning for a long time that it may use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine if it feels pushed into a corner. Also, last week or 2 weeks ago, Russia loosened its rules for using nuclear weapons. So now they permit themselves to use nuclear weapons in response even to a conventional weapons attack from a country that is backed by another nuclear country. Looking at you, Ukraine. I mean, it's about Ukraine. And they didn't say it as much, but that's obviously what it is. So both sides are jockeying for maximal position. And, Trump has talked a big game about being able to solve this conflict in 24 hours. I think, how they do that is going to be, it's really anyone's guess. Both sides are floating what they think are conditions for talks. The Russian side, I don't know if you saw today in the FT, there's a prominent Russian oligarch named Konstantin Malafeyev, who's very close to the Kremlin, who kind of gave this trial balloon, like what Putin would really be looking for in any negotiation with the West. By the way, you have to remember, Putin is actually doing pretty well in the war right now, right? And this is something actually I should have mentioned earlier, that when you ask about what's going on the ground, the Ukrainians are having an increasingly hard time holding the line. Russia is advancing slowly but steadily through eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainians are running out of men and manpower, and morale is getting lower. The U.S. Tried to get them to lower their draft age to 18 a couple days ago. They said nothing doing. They don't want to do it, but they're running out of men. On the Russian side, Russia's economy is not doing great, but their manpower shortages have been made up for the fact that North Korea is now sending them cannon fodder to fight against the Ukrainians. So from Russia's perspective, things aren't going terribly, right? So it would need to be some kind of interesting carrot, I think, for Putin to sit down at the table. But there was this thing today where one of Putin's sort of top confidants said, if the U.S. shows up with a proposal that just says we draw the lines where they are now and promise Ukraine won't join NATO for some time. We're going to tell them to stick it up their ass and go home or something like that, right? And that what Putin really wants is not just to settle Ukraine. He wants to sit down face to face with the United States and solve like every global problem together, right? That's what Putin really wants, is to be at that high Cold War level of like sitting across from a US president and just dividing up the world together. So that's their opening position. And the US side is talking about, drawing the lines where they are, putting off NATO membership for Ukraine. But I would just say, when you think about what's going to end the war in Ukraine, there's two pieces to it. One is, how do you stop the fighting? And the second piece is, how do you prevent it from starting again? And how you stop the fighting requires pushing the Ukrainians to accept that they're going to have to draw the lines where they are now. Everyone understands that. The second piece, which is preventing it from starting again, is to get the Russians to agree to something that they might not want to agree, which is, what security guarantees does the West give Ukraine so that Putin just doesn't just hang out for 2 years with a ceasefire and then invade again, in the third year of Trump's presidency, when he's concerned with trying to figure out whether J.D. Vance is going to be a successor or not, right? So I think those are the two pieces you got to think about.
So, Alex, let me ask you, because I want to play something for you first that kind of talks a little bit more about the foreign policy perspective and outreach that President Trump, in terms of somebody he just appointed special envoy to Ukraine, and Keith Kellogg. I want to play something that somebody said on television about that appointment. But I did want to ask you first, because I've kind of heard this in both ethos, right? Where it's like, Biden sending these missiles is kind of, maybe a bad decision because it's very provocative, right? But now Trump coming back is good for Russia because Ukraine is going to lose control of this. So is that the correct line of thinking? I'm asking this now more for the listener who maybe doesn't follow this and maybe has played Risk once in their lives in terms of world domination. So they're trying to figure this out. Like, I don't get it. The US is supplying these folks with weapons and missiles. They're firing them into Russian territories. But Russia invaded this country, and now the president who's coming back says he has a good relationship with Russia and he could end this war. Am I reading that wrong? That maybe this is provocative in terms of the Biden administration supplying these weapons and Ukraine actually using them, like you mentioned, firing them into Russian territories? Or is that a Russian talking point that I'm going to play you a clip from Vladimir Klitschko and Joe Rogan? Is that a Russian talking point that's being put out there?
No, look, I think it's provocative. The Russians certainly consider it to be provocative. Whether they, I think the thing to understand about the missiles is that it's not. Everyone understands that it's not going to change the overall balance of the war right now, right? Which is that Russia is basically consolidating its position in eastern Ukraine, and there's not, firing a couple of these missiles into rear positions in Russia is not going to change that dynamic. My read of what those missiles are for is less to shape the battlefield dynamic and more to shape the peace talk dynamic, right? And this goes back to this question of, what guarantees are there going to be that whatever settlement you reach now won't fall apart again with another Russian invasion in 6 months or 2 years or 3 years, right? And so I think the leverage that having these long-range missiles gives Ukraine, it's about it will help them to deter, possibly, or raise the cost of a future Russian invasion, right? And so I'm not so sure that Trump, Don Jr. said this is crazy, this is provoking World War III, all this. The Russians understand that these missiles are not going to severely harm the Russian position or put Putin in danger of losing this war. And so they're not going to use a nuclear weapon in response to these missiles, right? That is a Russian talking point. If you just look at the dynamics right now, there's no need for Putin to go to that level in a war that he's basically winning right now, right? But so Don Jr. was saying, this is crazy, this is provoking World War III. I'm not so sure that Trump and Keith Kellogg and Mike Waltz, I think it's kind of a gift to them, actually, because now they go into the administration where the baseline is Ukraine is a little bit better armed than it was before. And that can be part of the reality that shapes what peace negotiations and some kind of final settlement look like, right? Because Trump himself hasn't said anything bad about this, right? It's been Don Jr. has been doing the talking about that. So I think it's actually, less about, as I said, less about trying to turn the tide of the war and more trying to shape the context for a peace, if such a thing is possible.
Well, you fed perfectly into what I want to ask you next because you just mentioned Keith Kellogg there, and that's obviously an appointment that President Trump made as a special envoy to Ukraine. I want to play you something that I recently heard on a news segment from our friend of the pod here, Kervin O'Quinn, who formerly did intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance for the U.S. Army and now hosts the Geopolitics podcast This Week Explained. Take a listen to this. I want you to react on the other side.
No matter what side you sit on, whether you want more funds sent to Ukraine or you want, a brokered peace deal that stops all of the fighting there, this is the best candidate that could have been nominated for this position. And why do I say that? We have to listen to what he has said in the past, and retired General Kellogg has been, very supportive of Ukraine. He has pushed back against Russian demands, said that actually, if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table in good faith, with a key word there, good faith, then the U.S. just needs to send everything they have to Ukraine to fight this war and stop it. So he's going to be very hawkish there. He's also, he was brought in after his retirement for the Iraq war to slice through the bureaucracy that's there. So that's another aspect of this. Trump said, boy, day one, he wants this war over. He wants to broker a peace deal there. This is the guy to do it.
All right. So you heard a little bit of that there. I don't know Keith Kellogg from a hole in the wall, but again, I don't follow this as meticulously as you guys did. So tell us a little bit about what makes sense about this appointment. What do you agree or maybe disagree with respect to what Kervin said there? Is this the right man to hopefully broker a deal? And what does that deal look like?
Well, he advised Trump, the first Trump administration on Ukraine as well. He is, there's sort of this cartoonish view that Trump is like going to do whatever Putin says and is going to roll over for the Russians. You appoint a guy like Keith Kellogg, he's a pretty hard-nosed, old school, conservative military guy who, as you say, has spoken in very, firm terms about or as the quote says, has spoken in firm terms about what the expectations of Putin coming to the table are. Look, I think, again, everyone understands, reasonable people understand how this conflict or the contours of how this conflict ends, right? Which is that it's basically a land for peace backed by deterrence formula, right? Ukraine is going to have to give up some territory. They're not going to fight their way all the way back through the Donbass. They're not going to get Crimea back, right? That's obvious at this point. So they have to give that up at some level, right? In exchange for what? In exchange for peace, but then they have to be backed with some guarantee from the US or from Europe that they are going to be armed or protected or something that is going to prevent Russia from restarting the war. And, that's what Kellogg has basically said, right? Is, Putin needs to come to the table in good faith. But if he doesn't, he's prepared, Kellogg says at least he's prepared to arm the Ukrainians further. Whether Trump and the others around him will agree with that is an open question. But I don't think Trump wants to be made a fool of here. It's going to be a delicate dance. The guy he appointed as national security advisor, Mike Waltz, a former Florida congressman. He's had similar things to say about, he was very supportive of the idea of supporting Ukraine against the Russian invasion initially. His criticism was that the Biden administration, I think this turned out to be fair, didn't lay out a clear goal. Like, what was the point here? Was it to push the Russians out of Ukraine? Was it to knock Putin out of power, right? You remember a couple times Biden, maybe those were like slips, Freudian slips. Maybe they weren't. He was saying this guy's got to be out of power. It was never clear what the goal was. So the people that Trump has empowered on Ukraine specifically are people who do not seem to me to be particularly like dovish on Russia, right? I think they see that there is a U.S. national interest in bringing this war to a close, and they're going to push for a version of it that stops the war and keeps it stopped. The big question is, can they get Putin to the table to do that, right? Putin is going to ask for a lot. Like I mentioned earlier, one of Putin, this oligarch in Kremlin, sort of influential oligarch in the Kremlin, was saying, Putin's not going to be satisfied just with the settlement on Ukraine. He wants to talk about Gaza. He wants to talk about Syria. He wants to talk about Russia's relationship with China. He wants to talk about God knows what else. And so the Russians are going to try and inflate this and make it into a bigger thing. So that I think is the issue. But Kellogg and Waltz seem like guys who will bring a lot of heft to the table. And by the way, Marco Rubio is also, he will figure into this as he's been nominated as Secretary of State. He's I wouldn't call him a neocon, but he's pretty traditional Russia hawk views. He's questioned support for Ukraine for the same reason other people have, which is great to support Ukraine, but to what end? So I think the people on Ukraine are not going to be pushovers. Whether Trump, decides to override them and sweep in and do all the negotiating himself, that's the wild card, of course.
Right. Well, a bunch of follow-ups there. I'm going to cross off one of the questions I had about Marco Rubio. You kind of answered a little bit of what your thoughts are on him. So let's get into another conflict, because you just kind of said there that Vladimir Putin wants to talk about Gaza, Syria, all of this. Let's shift over to the war in Gaza, because the humanitarian crisis is unlike anything that people have seen. Al Jazeera continues to post daily videos of doctors that have served their, Doctors Without Borders that have come back, have talked about the humanitarian struggle. Another a World Central Kitchen van was, I believe, exploded recently, that Israel had targeted in an airstrike. There is so much happening in the war in Gaza. And then there was recently a hostage video that was posted online, I want to say about the last couple of days or so, calling for President Trump to help us, saying that Bibi Netanyahu has abandoned the hostages. There's still over 100 or so that are outstanding. This doesn't look like there's any end. We're going to get into the Hezbollah and Lebanon, situation with Israel and that ceasefire. But just from the latest on the war that's happening in Gaza, you wrote a piece recently about the U.S. vetoing the Gaza ceasefire resolution that came up in the UN. I want you to explain that in a second, but also explain for our listeners out there the latest that is happening in the war in Gaza.
Yeah. I mean, the UN in a situation like that does not have a whole lot of leverage to enforce a ceasefire, but the symbolism, is important. I mean, the U.S. vetoed it, right? They vetoed it. They said on a technicality that it seemed like the wording would allow Hamas to keep hostages until after the ceasefire was signed, rather than releasing them before. But it's clear that the U.S. administration, right, is giving Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, significant leeway to prosecute this war as he sees fit. And look, Trump is going to give him an even blanker check, right? I know there are people who, out of justifiable anger at the way that the Biden administration has handled this conflict, voted for Trump, thinking that, to stick it to the Democrats, stick it to Biden and Harris, stick it to Harris. And the thought that maybe Trump would be a kind of maverick on this issue. Only Nixon could go to China. Only Trump could really, box Bibi Netanyahu's ears and get him to stop this conflict. I talked to a lot of Arab American leaders who voted for Trump for that reason. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, you point a guy like Mike Huckabee, who is as hardcore a pro-Zionist evangelical as you can imagine, right? I mean, this guy supports not only whatever Israel wants to do in Gaza, but also supports Israel's basically outright annexation of the West Bank, because, for biblical reasons. I mean, these are the people that Trump is surrounding himself with. I don't see a situation in which the humanitarian situation in Gaza gets any better unless and until Netanyahu decides, and those around him decide, that they're done pummeling the enclave, that they're done destroying Hamas. So I think that tragedy only gets worse. And it's having regional repercussions as well. I mean, you mentioned Lebanon. Israel has a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Israel and Hezbollah have been trading fire basically since October 7th. The hope from Hamas's perspective was that Hezbollah engaging Israel from the north would relieve some pressure on Hamas in Gaza. It certainly didn't work out that way. Israel absolutely pummeled Hezbollah for the past several months, killed their long-time leader, Hassan Nasrallah, killed the guy who replaced him about 24 hours after that, destroyed huge caches of Hezbollah weaponry. And so Hezbollah has really been hobbled. They signed a ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah last Wednesday. it's sort of holding, but sort of cracking around the edges. Hamas is isolated. Hezbollah has been severely, damaged and downgraded in its capabilities to do anything. That's spilling over to Syria, if you want to talk about that in a second. But Bibi Netanyahu is, for all the international opprobrium and outrage about what's happening in Gaza and what Israel has done to Gaza in response to the October 7th attacks, Bibi has ridden it out and has put himself in a pretty commanding position, right? He was the outrage. I mean, remember, he went into this war where there were huge protests in Israel the whole summer before October 7th about Supreme Court reforms that Netanyahu wanted to make, and there was a big uproar in Israeli society. Then October 7th happened. He was blamed for it. He was incredibly unpopular, both for allowing October 7th to happen and then refusing, it appeared, to negotiate to get the hostages back because he preferred to destroy Hamas first. He was very unpopular, looked like he was hanging on by a thread, and now he's in a much more commanding position, both at home, where he's ridden it out, at least until now, and regionally, where he's weakened his two main opponents, Hamas and Hezbollah, and the Iranians are worried about it. And now Trump is coming in, who's extremely friendly to Bibi, basically said he'll give him a blank check. And so I think it's things are coming up aces for Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis right now, in a way that I think is not going to help the Palestinians, to say the least, in Gaza or in the West Bank.
Alex, I wanted to ask you, because as you were talking there, you had made allusions to the Arab Americans that you spoke with. We all know about during the primaries, the uncommitted vote in Michigan and some other places, and then obviously that vote kind of translating on election day and ultimately hurting Kamala Harris, amongst other reasons, obviously. And we talked about the war in Ukraine, talked about the war in Gaza. Now, I want to ask you just a simple voter question, as somebody who kind of follows this stuff, but articulates it so well, I think. You know how I feel about you, buddy. For somebody that is watching the world on fire, that sees the Biden-Harris administration not be able to handle these conflicts, even though they didn't start these conflicts. They didn't start October 7th. They didn't start Russia's aggression into Ukraine. What's happening in Syria, you're going to touch on in a second, or you can touch on as part of your answer. They see all of this happening. The guy who is running to be president and now is the president-elect said, remember how good it was, the economy in 2019? We had no wars, no foreign wars. And we didn't have any of that. And we see this administration, Afghanistan withdrawal, now these wars. Do you blame me? I know you mentioned it a little bit before about you could kind of sympathize a little bit with those Arab Americans who were like, I'm not going to vote for the Biden-Harris administration, stick it to them. But do you kind of see why people voted for Donald Trump just on this singular issue in terms of the foreign policy perspective? I don't want to get into other aspects of Donald Trump unless you want to, but from the foreign policy perspective of seeing what the Biden-Harris administration has done now versus what Trump did from 2017 to 2020, do you see it from that lens of like, yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense because that's what was happening then, and he also ran on that? Will this actually come to fruition, that all of these things get wrapped up under the Trump administration?
Well, I think Trump did a really good job of teasing people's selective memory about how things were great when he was president, right? I mean, in 2016, he ran on "Make America Great Again." When that "great again" was not so clear. In 2024, it was "Make America 2017 again." That was basically his, right. That's basically a large part of his campaign. I don't, during Trump 1.0, peace broke out globally and doves were flying everywhere. I mean, that's, it's a little bit of I mean, the US was still, assassinating Iranian leaders in the Middle East. Afghanistan was still a mess. Trump was unable to get out of it. Biden got out of it in the ugliest way possible, but Biden did it and Trump didn't, right? So I don't know. I mean, the idea that Trump was so strong and so unpredictable that no one in the world wanted to try any funny stuff while he was president. I don't think that's not a realistic assessment of how the world actually works. But I do think that the Biden and Harris administration got handed some absolutely horrible crises and just didn't really handle them all that well. I mean, Ukraine, it depends what your standard is, right? If your standard is, did Ukraine, win the war against Russia and preserve its sovereignty and drive the Russians out of the country with a clear objective? No, they didn't do that. But if your standard is Ukraine part of Russia now? Well, no, it's not, right? 80% of Ukraine is not under Russia, and that was not what Putin wanted to subjugate the country, right? So I think there's, it depends what your baseline is. Look, whether Trump is going to fix all these things in 24 hours, I don't think any sensible person thinks he will. He comes in at a very interesting time globally, though, right? I mean, major American partners are kind of in political flux, right? Germany is about to have an election early next year. Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor, is out. Canada, Justin Trudeau, not long for this world. He's going to be out. The UK, the Labour Party's in power again, Keir Starmer, but very weak, very unpopular. Lots of scandal and upheaval going on about the immigration question. Trump comes in really at a time when key allies are in a little bit of state of flux. You've got two gigantic wars going on, right? I don't know. We'll see. I mean, the relationship with China is going to be interesting to watch. The Chinese are having their own economic problems right now. And the last thing they want is to have a big tariff war again with Trump. Trump is promising just that. So he's coming in at an interesting time with a lot of balls in the air. And, we'll see if his deal-making savvy is able to pull it all together. I have my doubts, but certainly when people look at the world on fire, and it seems like the world was less on fire before Biden came into office, they say, well, maybe the same thing will repeat itself again.
This episode of Can We Please Talk podcast, as always, is presented by Fresh Roasted Coffee. Look, folks, let's stop for a second. Do you have a cup of coffee in your hand right now? You probably do, as you're on your way to work and you're listening to it, right? Is it fresh roasted coffee? Because it should be. Those are the K-Pods I get. The Colombiano, right? The dark Mexican blends. Those are the ones that I get from Fresh Roasted Coffee. But I got a coffee snob with me. He's my co-host. You know how much he loves his coffee. Nick, get these people to use the promo code and buy Fresh Roasted Coffee. Coffee snob it up here.
Yeah, folks, as you all know, I'm a French press person. I've used my Chemex. I'm all over the place with coffee. And Fresh Roasted Coffee for me is the reason I don't go out often for coffee. Where I have my parents come often. They come to visit the grandkids, and they, kind of come to see me and, Laura as well. But, they're here for their little ones. But the first thing they do every time they step foot in my house is they ask for a cup of coffee. And specifically, they're asking for fresh roasted coffee. So I put them onto this, this incredible company as well. And we've talked here about finding your coffee flavor, going there, taking the quiz. I've talked about the quality of the beans. If you are one who grinds at home like I do, if you're a Keurig person like Mike, you've got yourself covered. We're talking about single blends. We're talking about single origin, rather, from Guatemala, from, Sumatra blend. You've got all of that. But if you are a flavor person like I can be, especially at certain times of the year, obviously right now it's pumpkin spice season, right? From that other company. Pumpkin coffee is an option too at Fresh Roasted. Cold brew. This summer, they were taking over the summer with their ice beverage. We're here for FRC. CWPT, Fresh Roasted Coffee, FRC. We're hand in hand here. Look at my hands right now. So if you are a fan of the show, we expect you go out there, support them. They're doing incredible work. But more importantly, they're making really good coffee. If you're tired of going out there and having to spend your couple of bucks every day for a cup of Joe, you'll make the best coffee at home if you go through Fresh Roasted Coffee. But Mike, how are these folks going to be able to save a little bit of cheese on the process?
Yeah, well, it's an audio medium, so they're not going to be able to see your hands. But what you do want to do with your hands right now is click the link in our show notes or go to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Enter in the promo code Can We Please Get 20 when you get to checkout. When you purchase all of this delicious coffee that Nick mentioned, that I have mentioned, get all of it into the shopping cart. Can we please get 20? All one word. And 20, 20, not 20 spelled out. Can we please get 20? Enter in at checkout, get 20% off your first purchase. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com or click the link in our show notes right now. All right. So, Alex, we were talking about these wars. Now let's talk about how the U.S. handles these wars, some of these cabinet appointments that President-elect Trump has made. You touched a little bit about Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. I've done a few hits recently. I've kind of said this one makes the most sense because, again, senator, foreign intelligence committees, has met with dignitaries, speaks multiple languages, understands the dynamic of some of the South American countries and Latin American countries. So, again, I get the jump. But then there's one person that doesn't make any sense, and that's a guy who I worked on the weekend show as a PA at Fox and Friends, and he's the weekend anchor of Fox and Friends, and that's Pete Hegseth. And look, I know Pete served in the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we thank him for his service. I truly mean that. But that doesn't mean that somebody that served in the military should now be running the entire military. I want you to take a listen first to what I asked Congressman Pat Ryan, again, another Iraq veteran, about Pete Hegseth and the nomination from President-elect Trump. Take a listen to this. We're going to react on the other side.
If what he said is true, which is he values our troops, he values our country's safety and national security, he should understand that, to your point, he is woefully, inadequately unqualified in terms of leading the largest organization on the planet. The Pentagon is the largest office building in the world. Our military is millions of people, incredibly complex, dangerous time. He's said some things that I think are deeply at odds with our values, particularly his, I think, insulting women who have given their lives in combat, lost limbs. One of my good friends lost her arm in combat. Senator Duckworth lost both legs. I mean, how can you say women? It's just deeply against who we are, I think, as a country. Not to mention all the what seem to be credible issues around his own predatory sexual behavior and requiring a woman to sign an NDA. I mean, there's a lot there, and it all comes back to me. I should have started with this, that it's about our troops. Like, they deserve better than this. I mean, the Secretary of Defense, like, essentially holds the lives of our most precious resource, our young men and women brave enough to sign up to serve.
So there's one, Iraq veteran, somebody who served in the military, member of Congress, talking about somebody that, again, I've made this analogy to the business world. Just because you work somewhere, and I worked at Fox for 2 years, doesn't mean I should be the CEO of News Corp tomorrow if, somebody wanted to hand that over to me. So is my analogy spot on here as somebody who I know you've dabbled, I want to say, in covering the Pentagon, but you follow this closely. So when you saw the nomination, we're going to get into a couple others, Tulsi Gabbard specifically on the DNI front, but when you saw Pete Hegseth come through as Secretary of Defense, what ran through Alex's mind?
It didn't make it sense at all to me. I mean, look, there are competing currents within Trumpism, right? If we say that, right? There's the burn it all down aspect of it, right? There's that kind of populist rage against the establishment, right? There's that current of it. There's the big business, pro Wall Street component of it. There's the muscular protectionism to bring back industrial jobs and manufacturing to America component of it. There's the Trump is a brilliant, unique deal maker who just needs to be allowed to do what he wants aspect of it, right? There's all these different currents, and you see that in the cabinet, right? So when I saw Tulsi Gabbard, who's one of the burn it all down people, basically, right, appointed as DNI, well, it could sort of make sense. I mean, I don't know if she'll be appointed, she'll pass, be approved, right? But you could sort of see that, like, Trump feels like he wants to clean out what he sees as like this rotten deep state intelligence, whatever, right? You can sort of make sense. Hegseth at the Pentagon strikes me as nuts because that is a burn it all down type of candidate for the one thing that Trump does not seem to want to burn down, which is the U.S. military, right? Like you and like Pat Ryan says, right? It's not just about like sitting in a room with a bunch of medals on your chest and looking at maps and like making battle plans. Like it's running the largest bureaucracy in the world, right? I mean, it completely doesn't make any sense to me unless the point was to dangle someone so extreme that they wouldn't get through confirmation, to sort of move the Overton window so far that then he can slip someone else in who is, loyal to him and will follow his ideas, but not quite as extreme. Trump clashed with the military brass last time around, right? I mean, a lot of those guys didn't agree with his foreign policy views, or at least didn't agree with his foreign policy style, which was so erratic, foreign policy by tweet, sort of announcing things off the cuff and not reading his daily briefings and all this stuff. So that even if some of the core of the policies they might have agreed with, strong against China, strong against with Iran, just the way that he was doing it infuriated top generals. So I could see that Trump wants someone who he knows is going to be a real like loyal guy who's going to get the generals to understand his point of view and push back if they try and mess with him. But Hegseth is just like, doesn't, as you say, it makes you don't have someone from the mailroom running the company. I mean, just, there's a certain populist stick it to the establishment appeal about that. Fine, you do that with some other department, but the Defense Department, it just doesn't make sense to me. So I conclude from that again, either that it's sort of dangling this totally crazy candidate in order to get someone else approved who might seem moderate by comparison with Hegseth, or that policy at the Pentagon is going to be made by other people entirely. That's a sort of more alarming version of it, where you just get this kind of Hegseth in there as to keep the seat warm, way out of his depth, and that what's the decisions that are really being made about the Pentagon are being made elsewhere in the cabinet or elsewhere in the administration. I don't know who that would be or what that would be, but those are the only two options I can see, because Hegseth running the U.S. military is not. That's just not gonna work, I don't think.
So let me ask you, you kind of said burning down the house there, and I think of the LL Cool J show, but I don't know you would get that. So you would laugh at that, but I'm curious, and I think it was called burning down the house. But anyway, but I'm curious though, how are people abroad supposed to view a weekend television anchor being put in charge of the largest military in the world? As somebody who covers this, who travels internationally, who speaks 4 languages, like how are people abroad, specifically our adversaries, and more importantly, our allies, supposed to take a weekend television anchor, not even a weekday, a weekend television anchor being appointed to run the largest military in the world?
Well, I think, it depends who you are. I mean, I think if you are a China or a Russia, um, you're not mad at the idea that someone totally unqualified will be running the military of what is arguably your largest global competitor, right? Um, unless you think, again, that, theory number 2 is that Heggs is not going to be running this thing at all, and someone else can be running. So it introduces this kind of uncertainty. And I think that's the biggest thing about Trump, right? What really infuriates or alarms foreign leaders is not that Trump's ideas are so off the wall, because when you really peel away all the rhetoric, a lot of his ideas aren't on foreign policy, aren't that far outside of the mainstream. In fact, they're not really outside of the mainstream at all, right? I mean, using tariffs to extract, to force other trading partners to play fair in the trading, trade. That seems crazy by comparison with the past 20 or 30 years of like free trade orthodoxy, right? But traditionally, the U.S. used tariffs and used trade tools a lot, right? So it's not, in broader context, his trade policy is not crazy, right? His demand that NATO allies pay to meet their obligation to pay 2% of their GDP in defense is by itself not crazy at all. I mean, Obama was trying to do the same thing, trying to get European allies to pay to pay more. It's just that the way he does it, where he's saying, if you don't do it, I'll let Russia run through whatever country they want to if you're not going to do it, right? His stylistic thing is what's so infuriating and out and his norm breaking style. Let me put it this way. His style is a lot more norm breaking than his actual substance when you look at the policies, right, that he wants to pursue. And so what people find infuriating is that they never know which policy it's going to be. Because in addition to being stylistically all over the place, he's also kind of ideologically all over the place, which for people who support him is part of why they like him, because they don't think he's bound by the old orthodoxies of the Washington foreign policy blob or whatever you want to call it. But it can be very difficult from a foreign perspective to understand what's in this guy's head, and what he's going to do next. So I think that's how I think a lot of people read this more broadly. Hegseth in particular, I just think it's completely mind-boggling, right? And again, if you're Russia or China, you probably think, not a bad choice. This guy might make a total hash of that thing. But for others, I think it's just sort of alarming and confusing.
Alex, I want to ask you, as we head into 2025 now, obviously we're around December here. The holidays are coming up here on the US side. Unless something huge breaks with respect to the hostage negotiation and freeing of hostages over the next couple of weeks, which I know there's been some talks and some chatter around. Unless, all of a sudden Russia draws down their weapons like that Michael Jackson video where he points the gun down on the guy. I don't see anything really breaking in your world. So I kind of want to ask you for 2025, what is it that GZERO Media as an organization and beyond throughout the Trump administration is going to be focused on coverage wise? Like where do you guys see the puck moving towards? Because you mentioned China a little bit and the relationship with that. That's going to be interesting to watch. Do these wars kind of, finally, be squashed under the Trump administration and his policies towards them and what he's ran on? But like, what is Alex watching for in 2025, at least the first quarter of it? And what's GZERO Media as a company watching for on the Trump administration and the foreign policy stuff?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, Ukraine and Gaza and the widening war now in Syria as well. We didn't really talk about Syria, but just briefly, the civil war there has restarted around Aleppo, with some of the rebels knocking the Assad regime out, and Iran and Russia coming in to try and sort of help them out again. Turkey is involved, supporting the rebels against Assad. So that situation is going to flare up again. So that's one kind of small thing to watch. Look, I think, the two big things that Trump is going to try and move on thematically, right? The two specific conflicts he's going to have to look at are obviously Gaza and Ukraine. Thematically, the two things he's going to try and move on fastest are the kind of issues that straddle both domestic and foreign policy, which are trade and immigration, right? We didn't talk about immigration at all, but trade. He's coming in with this, waving a big stick already, saying he's going to impose up to 20% tariffs on every single thing that is imported to the United States and up to 60% on everything coming from China. During his first administration, he used the tariff tool to actually force China to make some concessions on unfair trading practices that they have. He managed to shrink the trade deficit with China, although the overall trade deficit with the world went up because people just imported from other countries. Now he's talking about this blanket thing where he's going to sort out once and for all the inequities and problems with the U.S. trade agreements, which in fairness, some of the trade agreements do have their problems. How far he's going to get with that in an environment where using those tools is potentially can stoke precisely the inflation that he spent the past 6 months hammering the Biden administration about. That's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch, right? How does Trump meet his promises without, breaking his promises, right? Meet his promises to, use tariffs to advance U.S. interests, but without breaking his promise to deliver the beautiful economy that people now seem to expect from him. So trade is going to be an interesting one. And then, of course, immigration as well. He's promised these mass deportations, starting with people who have deportation orders and criminal records. Okay, that sounds extreme, but it's kind of what the Obama administration was doing as well. And it's within the bounds of of what has been done. But if Stephen Miller, let's put it this kindly, hawk on immigration, I think is a nice way of describing him. If they want to go further and really try to deport all 15 million undocumented migrants in the United States, that is going to cause a huge social backlash, political backlash, economic problems. And I think that it can get dangerous quite quickly. So I think those are the two big policy issues. And the biggest thing is like, how much of a honeymoon period is Trump going to get? Right? Like the guy comes into office with control of Senate, with control of the House. His margin of victory was not quite a landslide, but for a guy convicted of 34 felonies and all these other things to win the election after 4 years out of power, it is a real message, right? So he comes in with this big mandate. But if there's one thing we know about elected leaders all around the world right now, it's that the honeymoon period is pretty short and people get really pissed off at incumbents very quickly. Right? Can Trump buck that trend? Maybe. He's bucked a whole lot of trends, and he has a kind of ideological sort of revolutionary movement about him. I shouldn't say ideological, but he has this kind of like messianic thing about him, right? So maybe people give him more time. The hardcore supporters do, but there's a lot of people who are on the fence about voting for Trump. And they did, but not with the enthusiasm of a true red hat MAGA believer. And I wonder how long Trump's honeymoon period lasts if he doesn't deliver on the things he said he was going to deliver, or starts to make things worse for moderates and people outside the base who he's promised all these things to. So that's what I would watch, man. I mean, it's tough because I think we are really in this like new era now, and it's just taking shape. And but those are the things I would look at.
Let me tell you something. I bought a jar of mayonnaise the other day for like $9.99. So Trump, if you bring the mayonnaise down, because I know it's made with eggs, all you got to do is bring the price of mayonnaise down, and I will give you some kudos. It is insane how much mayonnaise is.
It is, man. It is. And it doesn't help that like, the Democrats spend all this time pointing at like headline inflation figures are coming down. It's like, yeah, fine. If you take this like abstract headline basket of like averages across the entire, like the vibes matter. People's like daily experience at the grocery store matters. And, again, like we talked about earlier, the comparison that people are being encouraged to make is not between now and a year and a half ago when inflation was at its highest point in 40 years. The comparison they've been asked to make by Trump successfully, at least for now, is when things were before the pandemic, right? That's what people are trying or remember and think that they're going to get back to. I don't know if it's possible, but that's what Trump has dangled in front of people. Let's see how good he is at delivering it and how fast and how much patience people have with him.
That's right. That's right. You said it well there. And we'll see if inflation affects Juan Soto when he re-signs in the Bronx instead of Queens. Real quick, you got 10 seconds to make a case why Juan Soto, or give your hot take that you told me via text of why you don't want Juan Soto in Queens.
Okay, if the Mets sign him, I'm not mad at it, right? He's the best, young hitter of his generation. He'll be in peak form for the next 10 years. I get it, right? But what worries me is that the Mets are getting, and I'm a Mets fan, just so listeners know, okay? Like big Mets fan over here, all right? I worry that we're getting drawn into like more of a pissing match about who's going to get Juan Soto, right? Rather than focusing on a variety of needs that the Mets team has. It may be that Steve Cohen's got the money to go after Soto and also get, another elite starter or two and also get another bat and maybe re-sign Pete Alonso. If he's got the cash to do that and is willing to do it, fine. But like if we're getting distracted from this other stuff, fixing the bullpen, getting another starter by going after Soto, I'm going to be mad about it because our lineup was pretty good last year. With a couple small pieces, we're even better, but we got to get the pitching.
See, got to get the pitching, can break down Russia's aggression into the Donbass region, can break down the Mets bullpen or how they can clutch hit in Milwaukee in a series defining win there. Alex Kliment, GZERO Media, GZEROmedia.com. Go follow him on Twitter. I'm never calling it X, so just FYI there, Elon. I don't care if you come take this show. Take Nick first. You can follow him at SAO Sasha over on Twitter. Follow him on LinkedIn. Alex, you do fantastic work over at GZERO Media. I love you and the team over there. Continued success to you, my friend. Stay safe.
Always a pleasure. Good to be with you, man.